Welcome back to part two of the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We continue to record on Wednesday morning. But this is, ready everyone, year 3, unbelievable, of race class with Jonathan Feingold of Boston University Law School. And so since this is year 3, I'm going to start from the almost very beginning with that initial press release. Legislation restricting the teaching of race and racism in public schools and government entities has spread across the country. In an effort to respond, Boston University law professor Jonathan Feingold and me, a radio talk show host, have decided to offer Race Class, a once-a-month course conversation where listeners can hear what it's like to approach race and racism from a place of curiosity and history rather than fear and anxiety. And Jonathan, when we first sort of started this 2 years ago, unbelievable, it was because of the attack by people like Chris Rufo on critical race theory. All right. And to be honest with you, I didn't really know what critical race theory was. And probably I wasn't supposed to know what critical race theory was because it was only taught in law schools and only a handful of people in law school even studied it. So I'm thinking, well, what is this fear of CRT? And then I realized that it became a code for anything dealing with race. So you just basically said, oh my God, we got to get CRT out of elementary schools and out of high schools. It never was there, but there were black kids there and there were people of color there. And there probably was discussion about race and racism, but all of a sudden it became uncomfortable to talk about what people were actually living and seeing. And they were using CRT as their excuse. So now as we start year 3, you are actually beginning year 3 with a variation on a theme, but maybe a similar path. And it's entitled, When It Comes to DEI, the Left Keeps Helping the Right. So we're not talking about the old letters, CRT. We are talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, because that's where the new war is. We've seen it with Chris Rufo. We've seen it with billionaire Bill Ackman. We've seen it happening everywhere. And they like DEI better because it's more everywhere. It's in the workplace, it's in schools, and people have embraced the idea that this diversity, equity, and inclusion is not only something that should be acknowledged, it's something that should be embraced. And once you embrace something that maybe offends a bunch of white Christian nationalists or a bunch of white boys on the bench, you know they're going to go after it. So welcome back to the program. And again, thank you for year 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Arnie. It is always such a pleasure to be here with you, and I am grateful that you decided to take on this thing that's now Race Class, and it's been great. And I'm excited for another year. I have named this year multiple things in my head. It might be the Race Class hashtag Race is More Than a Category tour. It might be the Make American Smart Again tour. I'm not sure, but I have to give a shout out to CJ Hunt, the documentary filmmaker. And 3 years ago, he labeled all the discriminatory censorship laws dumb laws.
Wow.
Because it was just like, it was so clear-eyed. Mm-hmm. And so like if you see all of the efforts from the past 3 years to censor conversations in classrooms about really anything that are like sort of non-1960s mainstream, whether it's about gender identity, whether it's about racism, what have you. It's about preventing students and Americans generally from actually being smart about this stuff. There's in all sorts of ways, it's no different than if you had the government saying, you know what, no more climate science conversations in school. Like, or you know what, we're not going to let you actually do any research on gun violence. Turns out it can be hard to get money to do that, as it is. But I'm just glad that we have this space to have some conversations. And so right now, I'm teaching a critical race theory seminar, and it is such a joy, such a treat, because I get to be with students, and something that I really do try to impress upon them, and which becomes clear immediately, is that race and racism are 4-dimensional phenomena, but we tend to think of them as 2-dimensional.
Okay.
And unless we really take seriously the fact that these things that we're talking about are complex intellectual challenges and not just moral imperatives, then it changes the game. And so what we're doing here in these little bits and I'm filibustering myself, talking too much, not getting into substance, but it's just to flag that we're here to try to make very many contributions that are helpful in taking seriously that this is a very hard intellectual challenge and
It
not
is.
just a moral imperative. And so with that, thanks for the setup. You cannot like open up a news feed without seeing some right-wing troll blame DEI for like anything. Like I've seen folks blame DEI for like Silicon Valley Bank imploding. It's like a like capitalist like the like most obvious like concrete manifestation of the sort of capitalism that something like critical race theory would be uncomfortable with. Like blaming DEI for that, blaming DEI for like plane doors breaking.
The Boeing
The
photo was
like
incredible. Was
it's like
incredible, everyone.
DEI is responsible for that. Like a supposedly flaccid military for trains like falling off the tracks. And it's the thing that is, I think, very important to note is this duality. So these claims are in the sort of the same way that now Trump is like just using just saying the word border. Like
Hmm.
it's unserious. It's not about actually identifying some problem or making some sort of empirical descriptive causal claim. It's totally unserious. But at the same time, it's actually quite effective. There is a way in which unserious, like obviously sort of fabricated talking point saying broken plane because of DEI actually gains traction.
Yeah.
There's a common sense logic to it that is really important to actually take seriously. And that ultimately gets us into sort of the left. And one of the conversations that the conversation we'll have today is how the left, and I'm using the term broadly, but really to refer to institutions and individuals who do care about racial equality, who like their goal is not to legitimize social order, in which sort of gender and race remain these really powerful forces that differentially position individuals, just to access sort of like dignity. Um, and so we're going to walk through this because this obviously sort of unserious claims, but again, they travel. And there's a reason why, if you're a strategic right-wing think tank, you are going after DEI. And so my question for you, I guess let me just, as I was driving in this morning, I was also like feeling sort of provocative,
You
generally
should have heard me this
measured.
morning on Democracy Now! I was provocative there too. Keep
Yeah,
going.
you've been covering
Yeah.
stuff in New Hampshire.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I was like, should we start? All right, so let's just get provocative. I'm going to ask a couple questions. Then
Okay.
we'll get into the substance. How many so Larry Summers.
Remind everyone who Larry Summers is and
Why don't you
was,
remind
because,
everyone who
well,
Larry
he used to
Summers
be the
is?
president of Harvard.
Yeah,
So, I mean,
yeah.
he's like the guru who always speaks on the economy and is usually wrong.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Okay,
that's really that's the truth. But and to a
and
large extent, he was somewhat sexist in his position as the president of Harvard.
and
So that's
and
part of the reason he's no longer president of Harvard. But
and
keep
racial
going.
identity.
Yeah.
What is it? Is he sort of racialized
Oh, he's
as
white.
white?
Oh, excuse me.
How
I forgot.
many
I
how many
I thought that was obvious by everything else I just described. But keep going.
all right, we're getting very provocative today. How many times would he have to go in front of a congressional panel or say something on TV or make some public statement that is sort of wrong or inarticulate or like how many times would he have to break things for someone to say because he's white?
Exactly. It would never
Oh
happen.
no,
It
not a
would never, it
rhetorical
would never, it would
question.
never, it would never, it would never, ever happen. If it was a white woman, if it was a woman, if it was a black woman, if it was anybody else, they would basically create that identity. But when you were a white male speaking, it's almost like it was a flip of the tongue. It was a mistake. They cover for you. They put a mode of protection around you. Everybody else, however, is vulnerable.
Or or it's that this guy's actually not that smart. Or it's like or this guy had a bad day.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
my point. Exactly.
yeah, and part of my point is just so when we talk about why these sort of unserious claims that DEI is responsible for Boeing like getting their bolts wrong. I don't know why I didn't actually spend time reading about why the plane door fell off, but part of the reason why a claim like that is unserious can travel is because there are deeply ingrained social narratives um, that theorize or rationalize both gender and racial inequality.
Yes.
And there's a often just an unstated presumption that even if we might not like that boards, like CEOs, Fortune 500 companies, are almost entirely
Yeah.
comprised of men who'd be racialized as white, there's this sort of ickiness where, like, we don't like it, but it's unstated. It might not be thought, but maybe that actually sort of reflects some group-based difference. Again, it's unstated. A lot of people would like if you were asked them that, they would be like, well, I don't necessarily agree with that. But one of the reasons why I travel is because there is just ingrained in the American psyche this expectation that if you are someone who we would identify as white and male, you got there on your merit. Like you
Well,
deserve to be there.
it's not only a merit conversation, it's all they're familiar with. It's all they're familiar with. You've heard me tell this story. I remember when I was the first girl to run for governor in state history. And when I got more votes than any Democrat in history, just to let you know, Jonathan, but I still lost. And here was the question I asked myself. Did women lose or did Arnie lose? And what was so important to me was that Arnie had to lose. I did not want the perception that women can't cut it. I didn't want the perception that women can't win. I didn't want the perception that I wanted to make sure that at the end of that election, there was nobody walking around going, Arnie lost because she was a girl. Okay?
And
Because that to me is a DEI conversation that would absolutely have made me apoplectic.
when we say, so I started this off by sort of mentioning the names that I'm naming this year in my head, race
Right.
is more than a category, gender is more than a category. One of the ways in which race matters or gender matters is that people who belong to historically excluded groups, their performance almost always functions as a reflection of the group, as a barometer for whether or not
Brilliant.
the group
Brilliant.
deserves to be there. How many male politicians can flop without there ever being an anxiety that that flop is going to be read societally as implicating the group, men?
Yes. Yes.
It is, again, if we're just trying to identify more concretely the different ways in which there is unevenness between the paths that different political candidates, engineers have to travel, it's that if you are part of a group that has always been um, overrepresented, your failure never is something that you never have to worry about, that your individual failure, your bad day is going to be weaponized or just, unmindfully associated with something that is um, reinforcing negative stereotypes or biases about the group. But let's move on a little bit more, because it's so that is in a sense just sort of ways in which there's this ingrained expectations or assumptions about who belongs, who doesn't belong in different domains. It's also why data is always itself insufficient. The data don't tell the story. And so again, like Ron DeSantis and I, we don't disagree that there is racial inequality in the United States. We don't disagree that certain groups are overrepresented in the criminal legal system or incarcerated, or certain groups are overrepresented on boards. We just have very different theories as to why that is.
Exactly.
For Ron DeSantis, it's actually, well, the process is working. There's actual group-based differences that, like you, John, lefty, might not like it, but there's actual group-based differences that lead to those outcomes. For me, my general hypothesis is that all these processes are broken in the sense that they're not actually meritocratic, even in the like most sort of shallow sense of merit, because they among other things, tend to simply reward those who enjoy all sorts of social advantages, which can simply be belonging to a group where people assume that group like deserves to be there, and
Hmm.
not another group. DeSantis, though, doesn't just benefit from DeSantis or like any of the other right-wing trolls who, again, blame train
Christopher.
derailments on
Hmm.
DEI.
Hmm.
They also benefit from institutions that we would see as liberal institutions. And I'm going to go back to the affirmative action litigation from last year, Harvard and UNC. So this is a case in which Harvard and UNC are taking in a very sort of soft, modest, sort of minute way, considering the racial identity of some of their students. And the argument that they are making is that we need to do so because if we don't, we will lack racial diversity on campus, which really means white students will be overrepresented. Black, Latina students, some Asian American students will be underrepresented. And the question is, well, why Harvard? Why is it that you care about diversity? A, need to take race into account. B, Harvard says, well, because diversity in the classroom improves learning. That, like, you need to bring in different perspectives, different people. If you just have like a um, tiny cross section of the American public, your learning um, diminishes. And we need to take race into account because we can't get diversity until we get there. Harvard is not saying it explicitly, but what is that argument implying about who doesn't deserve to be there, about sort of the meritocracy baked into Harvard system, the way in which race does or otherwise does or doesn't sort of inform outcomes? Like, what's the implicit message that Harvard is sending out to the world?
We open doors for whites. And that's the norm. I mean, for Harvard, the norm was white, was probably wealthy, was having a family history, was contributing millions. That's the norm. And so now they're suddenly saying, well, maybe we should sort of expand on this and add to our norm. It's not like the norm should be the diversity, but in some ways, the diversity should be an outreach to their norm. And that's part of their problem.
So, and part of it is that Harvard's not saying that the rest of our, so if we've got this like big operation, this admissions like regime, we take a lot of factors into account. One of those factors, racial identity of an individual applicant. Harvard is not saying that there's anything wrong with the rest of the admissions system. They're not saying that the reason why you get a class in which wealthy white students are hugely overrepresented and many students of color are not there, Harvard's not saying it's because the system's broken. They're not
Broken.
saying that there's an
Exactly.
institutional deficiency we need to
Exactly.
fix. They are feeding the argument that considering race, taking diversity into account, is a departure from the quote unquote fair and square meritocratic regime. They're feeding the underlying theory of inequality that DeSantis weaponizes. And you might say, oh yeah, well what could they have said? Like maybe their system is, otherwise like unproblematic. Well, and we've talked about this before, but there's very little evidence of any sort presented in the Harvard litigation. But some that was presented flagged how multiple elements of Harvard's admissions process functioned as a racial preference for white students relative to all students of color, including Asian Americans. And this is evidence presented by Ed Bloom's folks. This like this wasn't the NAACP. This was the party suing Harvard. Ed Bloom and his sort of anti-DEI infrastructure. They said, look, there's part like white students are getting a racial preference relative to Asian Americans. One of the sources of that was Harvard's legacy regime.
Right.
And so if we're thinking about, and footnote here, in the discriminatory censorship laws, in some states, one sort of line of inquiry that the laws sought to stifle was any engagement with the notion of merit. and whether or not merit and sort of unmindful um, tropes about meritocracy can legitimize inequality. Um, and but like poll anyone in the like if you were to poll the entire United States, Arnie, what percentage of people do you think would agree with the statement legacy preferences are not meritocratic?
Almost everyone.
Almost everyone. Who benefits from Harvard's legacy preferences? You
What?
can just guess.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. White males for the most
Yeah.
part, but
So,
but
and
you're right.
I don't know the gender dimension of it, but it's students racialized as white and wealthy ones at that. Again, the plaintiff suing Harvard, Ed Bloom, his expert, tells us 43% of Harvard's white admits, 43% receive some sort of legacy boost. You might say, yeah, but that actually doesn't undercut the sort of most qualified students win this competition argument because if your legacy, your parents are sending you to the prep school, you're getting the varsity blues treatment light, so it's not actually fraud, it's just like all the resources. But that's not actually the case
Yeah.
because the same economists hired by Ed Bloom, they determined that one third, or excuse me, so 75% of Harvard's white admits who got the legacy bonus wouldn't have gotten in on their academic credentials alone. They were actually unqualified
Qualified.
if we are taking SAT and GPA as sort of the measures of merit. And so that meant that one third of Harvard's entire white admitted students in this recent period, like 5 years, only got in because of this legacy boost, which even if you're going to say is, I don't know, race neutral, it's not, but like, facially, formally it is in a Justice Thomas sort of way. No one's saying it's merit. And so that means that a third of Harvard's white admits, which is 1,600 students, they get
Yep.
into something that that is not merit. Um, that's more in absolute numbers students on campus than all of the Black students and Latina students that Harvard admitted in the same period. That everyone agrees, not sort of meritocratically admitted. Um,
So what do liberals do? So how do we, I only have 2 minutes left for this
yeah,
class, but like, how do we change that conversation? How do we start with what you are ending this conversation with? How do we begin this conversation? Because again, the repetition that we hear has really sort of reinforced the stereotype, has
yeah.
reinforced. And so I am just trying to figure out how do I reframe and then repeat and reframe so that people begin to understand that what they're attacking, diversity, equity, and inclusion, is not the problem.
So, well, one thing that I say, I adore my critical race studies students. I've only had them for 2 weeks. I adore them. They're wonderful. And one thing that we do in class is we identify sort of our analytical moves so
Mhm.
that we have like anchors that we can go back to. And one of the moves that my students identified is what they termed the introspection. And so there's this standard move that liberals tend to do, which is like, we think racism is a problem, but it is a problem out there. It exists out there. It's not in our institution. It's not in our university. It's not in our community, our classroom. It's out there. And the move is to take seriously that actually sort of racism, racial power, however it's manifesting, is also in here. And connecting that to Harvard, it's so a Harvard um, cannot get away with saying, well, we want racial diversity, but the only way to get it is to solve the racism problem out there. It's to
Yeah.
take seriously that there's ways in which Harvard's admission scheme that we take for granted is simply privileging students who are able to, create the illusion of merit by
And on
somehow.
that note, I have to create the illusion of ending this class. This is the third year of race class with Jonathan Feingold. He is a professor of CRT and race, actually, at Boston University Law School. And this begins year 3. We begin with what? The attack now, not on CRT, But DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you, Jonathan, so much. We're going to have to do this for an hour. I just know this. Anyway, we will be talking in a month. Again, thank you again.
Thanks, Arnie.
This is the Thursday edition of The Attitude with Arnie Arnesen and producers Dave Scott and Stephanie Collins. We will schmooze tomorrow, everyone. Ciao.